Hello, this is Formidable Mind. If you can open your Bibles up to the book of Job, and the whole purpose is God just and wise. And before we get into it, I wanted to talk about the three books of wisdom that kind of explore different themes, right? And there's Proverbs, the author is Solomon, and he reigned from 971 to 931 BC. And the whole purpose of Proverbs is to help God's people become wise and just because we learn that God has made a good and fair world with justice and love at its center, right? That's Proverbs. And then there's also the book of Ecclesiastes. There's Ecclesiastes, and the author is unknown. He's called the Preacher. And it basically says that each human at their core want to understand all the ways of God, right? And how God is acting in the world. And it goes on to saying that we will never understand God. Yes, God is within us, but also we are not entirely God just yet. We're not entirely God. And I want to chime in on that and say the faithful do not despair. So don't listen to necessarily everything that you read. In Ecclesiastes, the preacher says that God isn't always fair and God is unpredictable and hard to comprehend, right? Just like the wind. And so this is why this gets us to the book of Job and the purpose that God is just and wise, right? So Job chapter 1 verse 1, if you can look at that, it says that Job was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. And in chapter 1 verse 2 it says that Job had a lot of possessions and livestock and servants. And in chapter 4 it's Job chapter 1 verse 4, it says that Job had a beautiful family. He had a wife, he had sons, he had 3 daughters. And then, boom, immediately we get into it in chapter 1, still, verse 6. It says, Satan is allowed to test Job, right? And Satan meaning, Satan, the word literally meaning opposing God. Satan believes that Job is working the system to get what he wants, right? And he has everything that he wants. So therefore, does he actually fear God? How does he fear God, right? If he has everything that he wants. So in chapter 1, verse 12, Satan has to ask permission to test Job. And this is actually, I wanted to point this out because Satan's authority is under God's control, right? And so sometimes we cry out to the Lord, oh, maybe this is a test. Test us, Lord. Don't cry out to the Lord to test you because he will test you, right? That's a story for another time. In Job chapter 1, verse 13, God agrees to experiment and allows Satan to test Job, right? So Satan takes Job's property and children, takes everything, takes it all. And so then we see how Job reacts, right? And nope, Job remains sinless and did not charge God with the wrong. What Job says is, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away, right? And Job, he holds to his integrity, man. So Job in chapter 2, Satan now attacks Job's health, right? And Job still keeps his integrity. Uh, he said somewhere in the scripture, he said, I accepted the good of the Lord, now I must accept the evil, right? But then in chapter 3, Job has a little breakdown. He's human. Chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, Job curses the day of his birth because it began the path of his life. He says, let the day I perish which I was born. And so this continues all the way to chapter 10. He's like, wishes that he hadn't been born. And this is throughout the Hebrew poetry. So if you're looking at it yourself and you're trying to find it, it might take a little while. Throughout the Hebrew poetry, just go through the verses. And so verse 1 through 26, Job is mystified by his circumstances. He doesn't understand, and he doesn't want to suffer and grieve, right? So that's why he'd rather not have been born. That's why in chapter 3, verse 1 and 2, he curses the day that he was born. Okay, but then Job's friends come, right? And immediately they see Job in his condition, and they immediately accuse him. They said, Job, you must have done something wrong. God is always just, and he's ordered by fairness. So you must be getting what you deserve. And so the next 30 chapters or 35 chapters, it's just back and forth Hebrew poetry of his friends, his three friends, their dialogues with Job, right? And they're just accusing him. And they said such suffering is because of Job must have committed sin, right? And so they start listing off all these possible sins, all these possible moral failures. But Job, remember, was blameless and righteous and upright. He had not committed those sins. And let's take a moment to kind of really just sit here and think, like, this is a reminder, to be wise and sensitive when dealing with people in distress, right? Especially your friends. Don't assume you know something. Don't assume you know somebody's purpose, the Lord's purpose. Do not do that, right? So Job finds no comfort in his friends, and so Job goes through this little cycle where sometimes he has these moments where he's like, no, God is wise and just, like God has a plan, and then there's other moments where he accuses God of being reckless and unfair and corrupt. I mean, mind you, his circumstances are pretty extreme, right? And so by the end of the poetry, Job finds comfort when he asks God to explain himself in person, and really he demands God. But I'm kind of he asks God, right? So in chapter 38, uh, so God comes down in the form of a great storm cloud, right? And remember, you can't demand God to do anything. So God doesn't really give Job a response that he wants, and he doesn't explain that Satan is under God's authority, right? But God does take Job on a virtual tour of the universe, and he shows Job how grand the world is, right? And he asks Job, he's like, are you capable of running it? Are you capable of understanding it even? Are you capable maybe of running it and understanding it for just a day? And Job's overwhelmed, right? He's like, he's humbled completely. There's so much complexity and depth Job sees. Remember, all of this is floating around him. He sees the multiple universes. There's so much detail that we don't quite understand, but God makes it clear that God knows every little detail intimately, right? So Job is humbled. Job cannot do God's job and cannot understand the will of God, right? But then God continues, and God shows Job two wondrous beasts, right? A behemoth and a leviathan. And God says nobody can subdue these beasts. And listen carefully, because this is how God this is how it's kind of left, right? So nobody can subdue these beasts. And then God says they'd kill you without thinking about it. And then this is the interesting part. He says, but these beasts, even though they'd kill you without thinking about it, they're not evil. They're part of my good world. They're part of the good. They're part of my creation, right? And so the Lord ends up rebuking Job's friends for their folly and misinformation. Even though their friends claimed to know God, they hadn't truly paid close attention, right? And they weren't wise and sensitive in the matter. And so remember that God understands all this complexity within the universe, and his decision making really cannot be fathomed, right? This is God's wisdom. So Job couldn't comprehend this, and Job couldn't comprehend the Lord's wisdom and understand the Lord's will, right? So what does this mean? Don't become bitter. Let this lead you to humility. The Lord later restores Job's fortune, and it says that he gave him twice as much because of Job's humility, right? And he later blessed Job and gave him peace. And this is God's wisdom, right?